You've been here 3 years and you still can't hear your name said correctly. Not because people mispronounce it, they say it with care. With the specific effort of someone trying to honor a sound their language wasn't built for, but because the sounds they make are the sounds available to them and your name doesn't live in those sounds, and what comes back to you is a version of yourself that the language can approximate, but not reach. You've stopped correcting it. You introduce yourself with the approximation now, the version that fits, and somewhere in that small capitulation is the summary of the 3 years. You are standing in a convenience store at 11:45 at night, because the convenience store is the only place in your neighborhood that is still open, and also the only place where nobody expects you to be different from what you are. The staff have seen you enough times that the surprise is gone. You are the foreigner who comes in late and buys the same things and leaves. That's a category they have. You fit in the category. It's the closest thing to belonging you've found in 3 years, and it's a convenience store at midnight, and you've stopped finding this sad. That's the part that concerns you, actually, that you've stopped finding it sad. You came for a reason that made sense at the time and makes a different kind of sense now. Not a bad reason, a genuine one. You had spent 31 years in the same city, in the same radius of people who had known you since before you were fully formed, who related to you through the accumulated weight of a shared history that was also, you'd begun to feel, a kind of ceiling. You knew too well what you were to the people who knew you. You wanted to find out what you were to people who had no prior information. Japan was specific and also not specific. Specific in the sense that you had studied the language for 2 years before you came, had read extensively, had a contact at a language school in Osaka who could arrange a teaching position. Not specific in the sense that any sufficiently different place would have served the same function, the function of starting from zero, of being unknown, of having the possibility of becoming something other than the sum of 31 years of accumulated impressions. The first months were the version you'd imagined, mostly. Not perfect, the apartment was small, in a way that American descriptions of small Japanese apartments had not prepared you for. Which is to say that the descriptions were accurate, and the accuracy was not the same as understanding until you were standing in it. The language you'd studied for 2 years was sufficient for transactions and insufficient for everything else, which is the gap that 2 years of studying a language never tells you about, because the gap only reveals itself in the specific interactions that transactions are not. But there was novelty. And novelty does real work in the first months. The train system that ran to the second. The vending machines with their specific democracy of availability, hot coffee at midnight, cold beer at noon, the whole apparatus of convenience distributed so evenly across the city that need and fulfillment were almost never separated by distance. The food, which was not just good, but good in a way that suggested the entire relationship between people and what they ate had been thought through more carefully than you'd encountered before. You walked a lot. You ate a lot. You sent messages home that read as enthusiastic because they were. The school was fine. The students were polite in the specific way that makes it difficult to know whether you're reaching anyone, the politeness functioning as both warmth and distance simultaneously. You taught conversation, which meant you taught them to say things in English and listen to what they said, and occasionally something broke through the formality and you saw a person clearly for a moment before the formality settled back. Those moments were why you stayed in teaching longer than you'd planned. Your Japanese improved, not to the level you'd imagined before you came, which was a level that retrospectively reveals itself as based on a misunderstanding of what language actually is. Language is not vocabulary and grammar, or it is those things plus something else, something that lives in the space between the words, in what isn't said because it doesn't need to be said, because everyone who shares the language shares the context for it. You were outside that context. You could learn the words. You couldn't learn what the words assumed. This is the specific shape of the displacement that nobody explains to you before you move somewhere genuinely different. Not hostility, you encountered very little hostility, less than you'd been prepared for. What you encountered was the polite, genuine, fundamentally unbridgeable gap between someone who belongs to a place and someone who is visiting it for 3 years. The gap was maintained with such courtesy that for a long time you didn't feel it as a gap, you felt it as warmth, and by the time you understood the difference, the gap had been there the whole time. You made friends. That needs to be said because the displacement story without the friendships is incomplete and also wrong. Tanaka from the school, who spoke better English than he let on, and who had opinions about baseball and city planning and the specific failures of certain regional governments that he expressed with a directness he withheld from most other topics. Misa, a translator who had lived in 3 countries and understood the particular loneliness of being between languages in a way that came from experience rather than observation. The Australian couple in your building who had been in Osaka for 7 years, and who had the specific quality of people who have stopped expecting to be fully comfortable and have built a good life inside that acceptance. These friendships were real. They are still real. They did not solve the thing they couldn't solve, which is not an indictment of them. They solved what they could solve, which was considerable. What they couldn't solve was the three-layer problem you didn't have a name for until year 2. The first layer, you were always, in any room of Japanese people, the foreign one. Not in a hostile sense. In the visible sense, the immediately apparent sense, the sense that precedes any interaction and shapes every one of them before a word is exchanged. You could not enter a space neutrally. You arrived with the information of your difference already announced, and everything that followed was conducted in the awareness of it. The second layer, you had built your new life in a language you were good at but not fluent in, and the distance between good and fluent was where your personality lived. In English you were specific, capable of precision, able to make the distinction between what you meant exactly and what you meant approximately. In Japanese you were approximate. The approximation was improving, but improving is not arrived, and in the gap between approximate and precise, you were less yourself than you knew how to be, without noticing the loss in advance. The third layer, and the hardest, you had come to find out what you were to people who had no prior information. You found out. What you were to people who had no prior information was a foreigner in Japan, which is a category with real content, with specific assumptions and courtesies and limitations attached to it. And the category was applied to you with genuine warmth and complete consistency, and you could not get outside the category no matter what you did because the category was visible and you were inside it. You had left home to escape being known. You arrived somewhere you could not be known. The problem had inverted precisely, and the inversion had taken 3 years to fully reveal itself. Year 2 brought a quality of days that you didn't have a word for until Misa gave you one. Mono no aware. The bittersweet awareness of impermanence. The particular melancholy of beautiful things that don't last. She said it was not sadness exactly, more like the feeling of holding something while knowing you are holding it, the consciousness of the moment creating both the appreciation and the ache simultaneously. You said it sounded like what the whole country felt like to you. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Yes, you're experiencing it correctly." And that conversation was the most seen you'd felt in 3 years, and it lasted 20 minutes over coffee, and then you both went back to your lives. And the being seen receded in the way that things recede when they're not, built into the structure of your daily existence. The homesickness arrived late, which surprised you. You'd expected it in month 1 or 2, the acute early version that most people describe the specific missing of specific things, certain foods, certain voices, the light at a certain time of day in a certain season. That version arrived and passed quickly. What arrived in year 2 was different. Not missing specific things. Missing the state of being legible. Missing the experience of walking into a room and being read correctly by the room, not because the room knew you but because you and the room shared the same operating language, the same unspoken context, the same set of assumptions about what things meant. You hadn't known you'd taken that for granted until you'd been without it for 18 months, and the absence had become the texture of every day. There were good days inside the displacement. That also needs to be said. A Saturday in November when Tanaka took you to a baseball game and explained the specific etiquette of cheering, the organized chants, the way the crowd moved together with a coordination that in another context would have seemed uncanny, but here just seemed like an extension of how things were done. And the game itself was secondary to the experience of being inside that coordination, that collective attention, that shared thing. A morning in Kyoto on a solo trip where you arrived at a temple before the crowds and stood in a garden that had been designed to produce a specific feeling and produced it, the feeling arriving exactly as designed, and you understood in that moment that some things crossed the language gap cleanly, that beauty had a jurisdiction wider than context. Those days were real. They were not consolation prizes. They were what you came for. Part of what you came for, and you have them, and they're yours. But they exist inside the displacement rather than resolving it, which is the thing you had to accept. The good days don't fix the 3-layer problem. The friendships don't close the gap between belonging and visiting. The Japanese that keeps improving doesn't deliver you to the other side of fluency where the context lives. You are in Japan, genuinely in it, more in it than most foreigners manage, and you are also perpetually at its edge. Perpetually the person the language can approximate but not reach. That is the condition, not a failure. A condition. Year 3, you started thinking about going back. Not with defeat that took a while to establish. The distinction between going back as failure and going back as information. The information was specific. You had found out what you were to people with no prior information. The finding out had cost 3 years, and a number that represented all the financial optimism of someone who believed the life change would generate its own returns, which it had, just not financial ones. The returns were internal and not yet fully cataloged and might take longer to understand than 3 years or 6 or 10. The displacement had done the thing that displacements do when you let them run long enough. It had removed the ceiling, but it had also removed the floor. You were not the sum of 31 years of accumulated impressions anymore. You were also not anything else yet. Not fully. Not in a way that had found its shape. You were in between, which is what you'd wanted and is also a more uncomfortable place to stand than the wanting had suggested. The convenience store at midnight is the floor you have right now. Not metaphorically, literally. The floor is. This is the place where you fit in a category, where nobody expects more than the category requires, where you can buy coffee and noodles and exist without negotiating your existence. It's a narrow floor. It holds you. You are going to go back. Not yet. There are things here that aren't finished. Things that leaving now would leave in a state you're not willing to leave them in. Tanaka is in the middle of something you want to see through. The school has a class that started in April, and you will take them to the end of the year. There is a neighborhood you haven't walked through completely, and you will walk through it completely before you leave. But you are going to go back. You know this the way you know things that haven't happened yet but are already decided in the body before the mind, in the tiredness that has a specific quality different from ordinary tiredness, in the way you've started looking at things here the way you look at things you're preparing to miss. You will miss it. That's the true thing. The complicated true thing that the displacement story requires you to hold at the end. You will miss the trains that run to the second. You will miss Tanaka and his opinions about city planning. You will miss the vending machines with their specific democracy, hot coffee available at any hour, the whole city organized around the idea that what you need should not be far from where you are. You will miss being unknown. Even that. Especially that. Because unknown turned out to be its own kind of information about yourself. And the information is yours now, and you're taking it with you. And home will be different when you return to it because you will be different when you return to it. And the different is what you came for, even if the shape of it was not what you planned. The convenience store clerk says the approximation of your name as you leave. You say goodnight in Japanese. The door closes behind you. The city is very quiet at this hour. You walk home through it. You know the way.